Well, thank you very much, and thanks to everyone for coming out on what is such an Arctic early March evening. I very much appreciate you being here. So I'm going to talk about William Sharman and the volunteers in Lisburn and the Lagan Valley. So this is really about the 1780s and 1790s. The focus of the lecture is William Sharman, who's a middle-ranking member of the volunteers. I'll explain what that movement was in a little bit. He's colonel of the Union Regiment of Volunteers based in the Lagan Valley and in Mid-Down, and a man who emerged by the mid-1780s as a leading figure in Ulster in the campaign to attain democratic political reforms and to secure what was called legislative independence, the autonomy of the Irish Parliament, which had been granted in 1782, and also who came to embrace Catholic emancipation, then an extremely controversial subject, as an essential measure. Now, his role in the radical politics of volunteering has tended to be rather overlooked. He was for a time MP for Lisburn, but this obviously doesn't necessarily make you globally famous. And he lacked the national profile of patriot spokesmen in the Irish Parliament, such as Henry Grattan and Henry Flood, much better known figures. While at the same time, as a landed Anglican, he was not part of the radical Presbyterian circle in Belfast, which has attracted much more historical attention. Indeed, although taking a central part, as we'll see, in the celebrations in Belfast of the French Revolution in 1791, he did not join the United Irishmen and sat out the catastrophic rebellion of 1798 in political retirement at Moira Castle. So this talk is really an attempt to recover his non-revolutionary radical politics, its popular dynamics and its limitations, and its frustration in the 1790s, and perhaps also its legacy to 19th century Ulster. So let me see if I can get this working. Good, okay, so the volunteers, let's talk a little bit about them. So the volunteers were an Irish popular military movement independent of the state. It emerged in 1778 as a self-defence force against a potential French invasion, first of all in Belfast and then spreading out across the island. So this starts off as a military movement, drawing on older traditions of Protestant voluntary militias raised to deal with military emergencies. But what makes the volunteers different is very rapidly they became politicised and were drawn into controversies over Ireland's trading relations with Great Britain and its empire, over debates about the constraints on Irish self-government, and subsequently the structure of its parliament and the limits of representation within it. The great majority of the volunteers thus came to endorse the case made by the Patriot Party leadership in the Dublin Parliament that Ireland's constitutional as well as commercial subordination to Great Britain should be ended, and that its legislative independence as a sister kingdom to Great Britain, while remaining under the British Crown, should be conceded. In February 1782, the first of a series of conventions, attended in this case by 250 delegates, representing the 25,000 volunteers of the province of Ulster, assembled in Dungannon to endorse a set of political resolutions prepared by the Patriot leadership. And while the meeting agreed to support the parliamentary campaign for legislative independence, it did so in a manner that justified the right and the responsibility of the volunteers to act politically, to act independently of Parliament. Now, this campaign in 1782 was successful in extracting the so-called Irish Constitution of 1782 from a new and weak British government. But its limitations in reality were quickly apparent. and became more so as a more effective and decisive British government was formed under William Pitt the Younger in 1784. So from 1783-84 onwards, the movement starts to ask why legislative independence isn't working, why it isn't delivering the kind of reforms that at least Protestant public opinion in Ireland was expecting, and to blame the corruption and inequalities of the Irish Parliament and the electoral system for this failure. And this is where William Sharman comes in. He emerges as a leading figure in this campaign for the radical reform of the Irish Parliament. So who was William Sharman and what was his role in the movement? Well, he was the eldest son of John Sharman of Achavaray in County Antrim, just near Port Glenone, a small landowner of around 140 acres, so very small landowner, and a member of the Church of Ireland. As a very minor member of the Protestant landed interest, his prospects were greatly enhanced by his inheritance in 1775 of the property of his uncle, Captain William Sharman. So this young man from this relatively modest landed background comes under the patronage of his very successful uncle, Captain William Sharman, a man who had made money and reputation through military service and also acting as a colonial governor. He was assistant governor. He was assistant governor of Minorca in the Balearic Islands in the 1720s and 1730s. The Captain William Sharman also married into the O'Neill family of Shane's Castle, one of the dominant landed families of County Antrim, and indeed was appointed to one of their pocket boroughs, the borough of Randalstown, and was a member of the Irish Parliament. So Captain Sharman had bought significant plots of land in County Down, south of Banbridge, between Banbridge and Rathfriland, as well as a smaller estate in County Meath and also property in Dublin. So around 1756, William Sharman, our subject, William Sharman, was granted the post of Revenue Collector of Lisburn. This is where the Lisburn connection begins. This was a post worth around £300 a year, which is kind of respectable middle-class salary at that time. And he was almost certainly appointed to this post in Lisburn due to the patronage of his uncle, Captain Sharman, who was, as I've already mentioned, an MP at the time and well connected. When he inherits his uncle's property, he's named as his uncle's heir and inherits in 1775. But even before that, William Sharman has established himself as a country gentleman through renting the house and the domain of Moira Castle, as a modern representation of the Moira domain, from John Rawdon, the first Earl of Moira from 1774. With whom William Sharman developed a close relationship and indeed lent money to, and who was himself involved in patriot politics. So what we've got here it's a very unlikely story. William Sharman starts off essentially as a beneficiary of the Protestant ascendancy through the inheritance that he receives from his uncle of land, through his membership of the Church of Ireland, through his appointment to a well-paid administrative post, the collector of Lisburn. So in some ways it's quite surprising that he turns to radical politics in the 1780s. This requires a degree of explanation. Before we move on to that, I should say, well, this is a contemporary representation of Moira Castle based on a sketch by William Sharman's daughter, Eleanor, from about 1799, which is then copied by a Dublin artist, Gabriel Berenger, and is now in the Royal Irish Academy. So this is what the castle looked like at that time. In 1772, William Sharman had married this lady, Arminella Wilson, rather unusual name now, but it was quite common in the Wilson family. There are a number of Arminellas, and the name stayed in the family. So she was the daughter of Hill Wilson, who was a landowner at Purdysburn in County Down, and the collector of customs for Belfast, so a similar type of administrator to William. Arminella, who'd previously moved in fashionable London circles, appears to have been considered a very desirable match. You can see a poem published in a London journal praising her beauty and her taste up there, which I won't read out. But she's not just a beautiful face. She would prove to be an able partner for William in his subsequent political career. So clearly then they have this couple benefiting from their inherited privilege as part of the Anglo-Irish gentry world from which they came. But by the 1780s, William and also Arminella are moving into a very different type of politics and a very different political position, and the volunteers are central to this. So William, as I say, is appointed the revenue collector of Lisburn in 1756. He's resident initially in the town before he eventually moves out to Moira. And he gets to know the town very well. Lisburn at the time, as I'm sure you will be aware, is developing quite rapidly as a centre of the linen industry. Indeed, we hear in the Lisburn Museum and an Irish Linen Centre tonight. In 1763, the Lagan Navigation was opening up direct trade communications with Belfast. 1766 saw the establishment of the first damask factory in the town of Lisburn, established by the Scotsman William Coulson. So Lisburn is very much growing rapidly as a commercial and industrial centre focused on the linen trade. And Sharman is observing this and not only comes to know the town very well and the district around it very well, but also to have an understanding of its economic position. This was not without its cost. This rapid industrialisation was not without its cost. In 1762, for example, there were serious riots in the town of Lisburn, sparked by the imposition by the employers and social superiors of new regulations restricting the linen weavers of the town. So the weavers rioted against these new regulations. 10 years later, in 1772, in the countryside around Lisburn and around Moira, there was an outbreak of violent agrarian protest that in County Down took the name of the Hearts of Flint, which was a local variant of the Hearts of Steel, a movement, or the Steel Boys, a movement which had emerged from 1769 on Lord Donegal's estates in South County Antrim, in protest against increased rents and fines imposed on the working farmers by Donegal and his middlemen tenants. So both in town and countryside there are clear social tensions and conflicts, sometimes breaking out into acts of overt violence. This insurgency in 1772, for example, seriously alarmed Lady Moira, then living in Moira Castle, who wrote to the Lord Lieutenant expressing her fears that she and her family would be murdered by these Steel Boys. And this perhaps explains the decision of the Moiras to move out of the village of Moira and to move to their other big house at Montalto in Balnahinch, and to let the big house to the Sharmans. So for the new residents of Moira Castle in 1774, William and Arminella Sharman, challenges arose as to how best to engage with the disruptive social forces that had sparked the outbreaks of several years before, to find ways of channeling these into respectable and patriotic forms of expression, and to rebuild bonds of sociability between the landed elite, the urban middle class, and the surrounding rural population of farmers, labourers and weavers in a religiously mixed environment. William Sharman would rise to this task in the early 1780s, and in doing so his politics would move in a radical direction. So I think part of the explanation is a response to the sense of social crisis in the 1760s and 1770s. Okay, so let's go back to William Sharman. So he himself has become a landowner. Sorry, I didn't explain with that slide was. So here we have the Lagan navigation. You can see Belfast there at one end. In 1763, it's opened as far as Lisburn. The aim is to extend it all the way to Lough Neagh, past Moira. So you can see this is very much the economic zone of the heart of the linen industry. And the second section is finally opened in 1794. So Sharman himself has become a landowner. His estates are, as I said, in the barony of Upper Ivey, south of Banbridge, the parish of Drumballyroney. And he gets a reputation as being a sympathetic landowner, an improver, but also, in the words of one newspaper commentary, one whose wealth was not wrung from the bowels of a pillaged tenantry, and one who expends his money in relieving the distresses of the poor and wiping the eye from the tear of misery. So he gets this reputation as being a very sympathetic and indulgent landowner. Which he shares with Lord Moira. Lord Moira also has a reputation as a significant improver and a promoter of the linen industry in the countryside as well. So this was one of the very famous William Hinks engravings of the Irish linen industry produced in 1783. And this one, as you can see, if you've got the detail here, is dedicated to Lord Moira and is, according to Hinks anyway, representing a scene taken from the life in a cottage on one of Lord Moira's estates, either at Balnahinch or around Moira itself. It depicts women spinning, reeling with the clock reel and boiling the yarn, taken on the spot in the County Down cottage. Okay, so this is the background to the political movement that I'm now coming back to. So we've established the volunteers are there, they're becoming politicised. How does Sharman become involved? Lord Moira establishes volunteer companies, both at Balnahinch and at Moira in 1779. But it's not until 1781 that we see a report of William Sharman being directly involved. In July of that year, it's reported that he attended a meeting of the Moira Corps, or the Moira Company, in which he was thanked for his great attention and friendship to the company and for a generous present of 60 stand of arms and a band of music. So this was an expensive outlay, a popular one also, given the government's reluctance to give working weaponry to the volunteer companies. In response, the company resolved that we will, upon every occasion, use our utmost endeavours to preserve the peace and execute the laws of our country. As the most convincing proof we can give of our sincere gratitude to our worthy captains. You can see this kind of, rhetoric of generosity and reciprocity on the part of the members of the company. We will uphold law and order and peace in the countryside. If Sharman's first command in Moira was partly due to his due towards deference towards him as the village's resident squire, even though he wasn't its landlord, and his ability to equip the unit, it also owed something to the support he received from the local Presbyterian minister, the Reverend Andrew Craig. So Craig is in 1781-82 the Presbyterian minister of Moira, but also a volunteer enthusiast and chaplain who requested that Sharman take on a leadership role, contrary, as Craig wrote, to the expectations and perhaps wishes of some of the neighbouring gentlemen who took no part in the movement. William Sharman's closeness to Presbyterian political agents such as Craig was to remain marked throughout his volunteering career. And indeed Craig, who was subsequently minister of First Lisburn congregation just across the road, also eventually became his brother-in-law. So I'll come back to this portrait. There's obviously a portrait of William Sharman as a commander of the volunteers. I'm going to come back to this image a little bit later. Oh, in fact, I might just stay with that one for the moment. Okay, right. So in the following year, It's a 1782. Sharman was elected Lieutenant Colonel of the Union Regiment of Volunteers. So he starts off as captain of the Moira Volunteers. By the next year, he's colonel or lieutenant colonel, later full colonel of the Union Regiment of Volunteers. So this is a name that reflected the amalgamation of a number of existing companies: the Moira, Balnahinch, Roseville, Ackley, and First Lisburn Volunteer companies. Reflecting its quasi-democratic nature, the regiment's companies sent delegates to meet at Moira Market House. I have a report of this in April 1782 to debate the resolutions just passed at the Dungannon Convention that February. They resolved, as you can see from the report here, at a meeting chaired by Colonel Sharman, that while loyal to the Crown and to the British connection, His Majesty's people of Ireland are a free people, inheritors of a free constitution descended to them from their ancestors, and that it is an undoubted right of this free people, a right they value as their lives, to be governed solely by their own laws. This is very much a statement of support for the autonomy of the Irish Parliament in governing Ireland. In such an atmosphere of rising political expectations, increasingly popular participation in political debate, an insistence following the American example, of course in the context of the American Revolution, on the consent of the people for the legitimacy of political institutions, Sharman's position within the movement was increasingly dependent on his ability to articulate and support popular sentiment rather than on his social status. Okay? So as we move on through the 1780s, it's not enough to be the local squire or to provide money to remain popular within the volunteer movement. You need to be in alignment with this increasingly radical political sentiment, and the Sharman is taking this journey, is on this process of political change. And interesting enough, Lord Moira drops out. Lord Moira, who's much more politically moderate than Sharman, decides that he's had enough and drops out of participation in the volunteer movement by 1784. This is common of many of the original landed participants in the volunteer movement. They start to fall away. In 1783, there's an election, a general election, and in County Down, the volunteers are actively involved in supporting reform candidates against the established landed interest, particularly the Hill family interest based at Hillsborough in County Down, one of the two dominant families in the county. And the volunteer press criticised any members who voted for the Hills. And indeed, within the Union Regiment, there is almost a kind of kangaroo court set up to try one of the officers who had allegedly actively supported the Hills in the County Down election. So he has to defend himself in front of the assembled companies, and all the companies except one, except the Lisburn company, which he was an officer in, vote for his expulsion, and the regiment removes him as an officer. So there's a kind of element of democratic consent required to be an officer within the volunteers at this time. So such forms of public shaming, such as the public trial of officers who weren't in political alignment with the movement, was characteristic of volunteer units, and indeed necessary to maintain military discipline and political unity in what were voluntary bodies operating within the loose bonds of associational culture. Sharman's new command had initially incorporated units from the town of Lisburn and nearby Roseville in the parish of Blairus, both of which lay on the estates of the absentee Earl of Hertford. Political discontent had been growing in the developing linen town and its environs for some time, and a satirical squib against the borough of Lisburn's two MPs, representing them as gluttonous and corrupt clients of the landlord, had appeared in 1779. A town meeting the following year upheld patriot demands for the repeal of Poyning's Law and the Declaratory Act, the two pieces of legislation which had subordinated the Irish Parliament to the British Privy Council and the British Parliament. Lord Hertford's public statement in 1782 that the volunteers should be content with attaining free trade and legislative independence and that the country should put commercial development ahead of any further agitation did not endear him to the town's radicals. So we have a kind of building up conflict within the town of Lisburn between its proprietor, Lord Hertford, and the radicals very much associated with the volunteer movement. Other volunteer units were formed in Lisburn, including the True Blues and the Lisburn Fusiliers, whose captain was the future Patriot MP William Todd Jones. And these were equally outspoken in advocating radical political reform by 1782. Only the first of these units, the 1st Lisburn Company, was associated with Sharman's Union Regiment and ultimately left that regiment. The other two joined the Red and Blue battalions of the Ulster Regiment led by Colonel Hercules Rowley. But these divisions are not over politics, they're simply associational. All of them shared an assertive radicalism which would work to Sharman's benefit in the elections of 1783, which I'll come back to. And indeed, all of these units participated in summer manoeuvres in Belfast in 1782, bringing the local radicals of the Lagan Valley into connection with the reformist networks located in Ulster's most populous and rapidly developing town. Around 4,000 volunteers participated in this event in August 1782, which combined an assertion of military display with an inclusive and politicised camaraderie. Even if exaggerated for propaganda purposes, such reports suggest that these exercises helped, at least to some extent and for a time, to break down class barriers within the movement. Now, the military capacity of the volunteers as anything other than a local peacekeeping force has been disputed, even as numbers expanded to a reported peak of nearly 89,000 across Ireland by mid-1782. Their abilities were never put to the test. There was not a French invasion, there was no rebellion in the period, so we don't know how they would have performed militarily. But they anticipated that this might be the case. Newly elected amateur officers faced a steep learning curve, and unlike his uncle, William Sharman had no previous military experience. As an officer, he was dependent on books like this, instructional guides as to how to adopt military tactics. This is from the Concise Compendium of Military Manoeuvres, which was published in Dublin specifically for the volunteers in 1781. And he seems at least to have taken his responsibilities very seriously. He promoted military order and skills throughout his part-time and voluntary soldiers. He retained significant numbers of active members within the units under his control, and by 1784 the Union Regiment numbered some 300 men and had acquired 2 6-pounder field guns. By 1791 it was differentiated into, quote, a troop of horse, a few companies of grenadiers and light infantry, and a very fine band of music. One English observer noted of the regiment that year, "They are in general very fine men, very well clothed, appointed and disciplined." It's unclear if Sharman also contributed to the cost of uniforms, as some of the other volunteer officers did, but the regiment was distinguished by scarlet and green trimming to their military tunics. Music was also an important factor to the movement, and a martial air entitled Colonel Sharman's Quickstep was composed for regimental gatherings, and reportedly was still being played in and around Lisburn as late as the 1850s. More seriously, Sharman sought to develop musketry skills through regular competitions for the best marksman in each company and in the regiment, with the winners being awarded silver or gold medals at his expense. Okay, let's get back to politics. So whatever their objective military capabilities, the volunteers took their status as a people's army very seriously and placed great emphasis on drilling and military display. An albeit favourably biased account in the Belfast Mercury informed its readers that a mock action of an attack and defence on a camp carried out by the units participating in the Belfast Review of 1784, including the Union Regiment, had met the highest military standards. At the same time, volunteer elan depended on a culture of male sociability that was at least temporarily elided class differences between officers and men. Following a parade at Moira that October, the entire company repaired to the market house to dine with their beloved colonel, following which many spirited toasts were drunk and the evening spent in the utmost festivity and harmony. A far cry from the class-related unrest of 1762 and 1772 in the district. Now, Sharman's political standing within the volunteers in Ulster rose rapidly in 1782 to 3 at a time when the movement was convulsed by divisions created by Henry Flood's campaign for a formal renunciation of Britain's claim to legislate for Ireland, and the defection of many moderate officers to the newly created government fencible force. In July 1783, Sharman chaired a meeting of representatives of 45 Ulster Corps in Lisburn, which resolved to requisition another provincial convention at Dungannon, this time to focus on the subject of parliamentary reform. So Sharman is right at the centre of calling these meetings to prepare the ground for another mass convention. This is a late 19th century representation of the volunteers in Lisburn, one of a series created by the Carey brothers, John Carey in this case, some of which I'm sure you'll be familiar with. So Sharman was selected to act as secretary of the Committee of Correspondence of the Ulster Volunteers, with responsibility for preparing the resolutions for the new Dungannon Convention and eliciting the opinions of the leading English reformers to inform the deliberations of this convention. It's under his name that this document, the Address to the Volunteer Army of Ulster, was published in July 1783, strongly asserting the continuing right, now that the American War was over, for the volunteers to continue to act as a body of armed citizens to ensure that the objectives of legislative independence were realised in practice. The case was couched in the Whiggish language of restoring the balance of an ancient constitution, corrupted by venality and party interests. As you see from the quotation here, parliamentary reform was the only measure which can give permanency to the late renovation of our constitution, or restore that virtue to the representative body, without which, though the mere forms of a free government may be preserved, its spirit must inevitably perish. Catholic emancipation is not explicitly mentioned in this document, but it's hinted at through the statement that by inculcating the glorious spirit of toleration, it has united the once distressed inhabitants of this country into an indissoluble mass. So that by talking about bringing Catholics into the indissoluble mass of the people, the kind of, if you like, the way is being prepared here for proposals around Catholic emancipation, which we'll see will take stronger form. Now, Lord Charlemont, the official leader of the Irish Volunteers, regarded such proceedings as unconstitutional, and he declined to participate in the 1783 Dungannon Convention. He warns that any inclusion of the Catholic question in their deliberations would be extremely dangerous. Nevertheless, Sharman and the people around him proceed to hold the convention. And this is a publication of the responses to the letters that Sharman sent out to the leading English parliamentary reformers to get their opinions. So, and he writes to them in the name of the 15,000 volunteers of Ulster and Munster, who had already expressed support for the principle of parliamentary reform. The Correspondence Committee's proposals to the 1783 Dungannon Convention, which essentially are penned by Sharman, were remarkably radical for this period. So what did they mean by parliamentary reform? They talk about annual parliaments, annual elections to stop, if you like, the interest of the political class from remaining dominant. Vote by secret ballot rather than open voting. Very radical demand at the time. The abolition of mean, decayed or depopulated boroughs, the corrupt pocket boroughs, which the magnates controlled and the government controlled, and the transfer of those seats to unenfranchised or underrepresented towns and counties, and giving the vote to male 40-shilling freeholders in the counties and £5 householders in the towns. So this is not universal suffrage, but these are really very low property qualifications to have the vote in the context of the 18th century. Bribery of electors would be criminalised, and crucially, the committee recommended the extension of the suffrage to such description of Roman Catholics as the National Convention may deem proper objects of that great trust. So this is a statement of support for Catholic emancipation in principle, while hedging on the details. The convention thanked Sharman, who chaired it, and the committee, and endorsed these recommendations, nominating 5 delegates to go from each county, including Sharman, to represent them at a national convention of volunteers to be held in Dublin in November 1783. But this was as far as the volunteer reform project was to go at this time. Uneasy about the political implications of Catholic emancipation, Patriot leaders such as Henry Flood and Lord Charlemont marginalised it from debate, while at the same time overplaying their hand on parliamentary reform. Flood's appearance in the Irish House of Commons, hot foot from the National Convention at the Rotunda, still wearing his volunteer uniform, as he proposed a reform bill based on the Dungannon resolutions, provoked hostility from the Commons and abandonment by his former Patriot ally Henry Grattan, satirised in this cartoon that you can see here. The reform bill was thrown out by the House of Commons, and Charlemont persuaded the volunteers to disperse without further authority to further challenge to parliamentary authority. So this initiative, which Sharman is central to try and leverage the Irish Parliament into voting for parliamentary reform, essentially fails in 1783. This is a major defeat for the reformist movement, but it doesn't lead to a collapse in belief in the volunteer project on the part of men like William Sharman. They see this as a setback rather than as the end of the campaign. At the general election of 1783, he himself was elected to the Irish Parliament as one of the 2 MPs for the borough of Lisburn. So Lisburn at the time was what was called a pot-walloping borough, which meant it had an electorate, in this case of between 350 and 400 tax-paying householders, usually under the tight control of the absentee landowner, the Earl of Hertford. But with volunteer enthusiasm at its peak, Sharman and his fellow volunteer officer, William Todd Jones, stood on a platform that exhorted independent electors to vote with their consciences and to spurn attempts to bribe or intimidate them. And with economic distress also undermining traditional forms of deference, they carried the hustings, and after polling a few tallies, quote, they were declared duly elected and chaired with every honour. This town is in a general blaze of rejoicing for the glorious triumph of a people over an aristocracy that formerly ruled that borough and this country with a rod of iron. And indeed there would be an epic poem penned locally extolling the episode with some hyperbole as, quote, Rome delivered and tyranny expelled by Messrs. Sharman and Jones of Lisburn. However, it seems that Sharman found participation in the Irish Parliament, you see represented here in the famous painting by Whately, frustrating. He was a rare parliamentary speaker, and although he's widely respected on the opposition ranks, it's quite clear his preference was very much for the continuation of outdoor activity. He's fired from his job as collector of Lisburn in 1784, which provoked a number of protests, but it's hardly surprising given that he was in open opposition to the government. So what did patriotism mean to a man like William Sharman? I'm not going to go through this in detail, but it's clear from the statements that he makes that he has adopted a kind of a form of an Anglophobic economic nationalism. You can see in this quotation, which I won't go through in detail, that he regards Ireland's economy as having been destroyed by malign British or English influence, leaving only the linen manufacture, which itself is, he thinks, extremely vulnerable to keep the people alive. Consistent with such views, he voted against the introduction of Pitt's commercial resolutions for equalising trade with Great Britain in 1785. Ultimately, however, he believed meaningful economic reform could only follow patriotic political mobilisation for constitutional change. It was, however, for the electors to act to pursue the interests of the nation as a whole rather than that of themselves or their patrons. So Sharman remained committed to pursuing reform through non-parliamentary agitation. A county antrim meeting attended by over 500 nominated him and other delegates to a new National Congress for Reform in Dublin, which he chaired as well, interestingly using the term Congress, very much an American originating term. This in 1784, and even with the propagandistic support of the young Dr. William Drennan, who writes his Letters of Orellana in support of the National Congress in 1784, this fails to go anywhere. So Sharman turns back very much to the volunteers and to seeking to keep the volunteers going and hoping that there will be a moment of volunteer revival. Now, an example of the kind of, if you like, political culture of volunteering that we see even in this period of decline of the national movement is this extract here. So this is a report of an October 1784 meeting of the Union Regiment in Moira, which William and Arminella Sharman appear as the hosts for not just a meeting, but for the celebration of the values of volunteering in what is described as a Temple of Liberty. So this Temple of Liberty is a temporary structure erected on the Moira domain for the regiment, in a sense, to come and dine and to make political speeches within. I'll just read the extract here. So it's impossible to describe the elegance, grandeur and brilliancy of the scene that succeeded. Mrs. Sharman had fitted up for the reception of the regiment a gallery of 90 feet long in a style that gave the most convincing proof of her generosity and taste. Over the arch at the entrance was inscribed in large characters, "The Temple of Liberty." From the floor was raised 22 arches of laurel boughs. The roof consisted of 9 Gothic arches composing the same, from which hung 12 branches which served to illuminate the building. Perhaps there have been few instances of such a crowd of guests entertained in so elegant and so splendid a manner. All was joy, harmony and ease. Everyone vied with his neighbour in extolling the hospitality and taste of their beloved colonel and his amiable lady. Many spirited and patriotic toasts were drunk. The night was crowned with the utmost festivity, and the whole party departed pleased and happy. So this description gives us a rare picture of Arminella Sharman as a popular political hostess, a role she shared with many other Irish women drawn into the active involvement with the politics of volunteering. The Sharman's Temple of Liberty in rural County Down was a much simpler and temporary edifice than others erected in England and in America under the same name, but its iconography shared something with these patriotic manifestations from across the Anglophone Atlantic world. Sharman's speech to the regiment at the occasion highlighted the constitutional doctrines that shaped his conception of liberty. He had, he assured them, only stood up for the rights of human nature. Their political mission was, he believed, restorative, and collective action in arms was required to defend their covenanted freedoms in the face of official corruption. And nor were these Moira demonstrations of the mid-1780s the swan song of the movement in the region. William Sharman continued to command his Union regiment. At popular annual summer reviews of the volunteers in Belfast, Dromore and Moira in 1785-7. Still anticipating a change in the wind that would propel the movement back to the forefront of reforming politics. And this moment comes, of course, on the 14th of July, 1789. European events would now transform the movement. At Dromore in September 1789, in the wake of the fall of the Bastille in Paris, Sharman again addressed the volunteers on the legitimacy of bearing arms in defence of liberty and the moral duty of electors to act against the political plunderers of their country. In their response, the volunteers at Dromore lamented that the present state of the country should be so unfavourable to the exertion of a virtue like yours, and observed signs of a change in the wind, hoping that, quote, a portion of that light whose brilliancy at this instance illuminates a neighbouring kingdom, that's France, and with such distinguished lustre would soon also fall on Ireland. And indeed, the phenomenal impact of the French Revolution would soon lead to both a wider revival of political volunteering and the resurgence of a radicalism that would eventually alarm and ultimately eclipse that of Sharman and men of his generation. So this revival, this post-French Revolution revival, is still too weak in 1790 to prevent him deciding to stand down as MP for Lisburn. The Parliament had sat for 7 years, which was the maximum at that time, and he decides not to contest the seat again in 1790, largely because the Hertfords were extremely angry at losing the seat in 1783 and were essentially throwing money at the opportunity to regain it in 1790. So Sharman decides not to stand. Todd Jones does stand, but is defeated and has to rant and rave against proprietorial corruption as the cause of his defeat. Volunteers are not defeated everywhere. In County Antrim, the Colonel's colleagues, Colonel John O'Neill and Hercules Rowley, were elected as MPs for that county. And at that point, the self-declared reformer Robert Stewart, later better known as Viscount Castlereagh after 1796, was successful in County Antrim against the anti-Reform Hill movement. At that point, Stewart, Castlereagh's later become, was proposing himself as a reformer. Patriot writers such as the poet Thomas Atkinson continued to laud Sharman as the embodiment of civic virtues. You can see in this long praise poem published in 1791. So in 1790, the Northern Whig Club was established in Belfast to promote parliamentary reform, and it very rapidly attracted significant numbers of radical middle class members, many of whom were also active volunteers, alongside some more conservative reformers such as Lord Charlemont. William Sharman and William Todd Jones were both amongst its founding members, and it soon adopted a stance in line with Sharman's views on parliamentary reform, resolving in April 1790 that when an unmasked and shameless system of ministerial corruption manifests an intention to sap the spirit, virtue and independence of Parliament, it is time for the people to look to themselves, or they must soon sink to the most ignominious slavery. However, the club, while it agreed on parliamentary reform, quickly became deadlocked, as it always was the case, on the unavoidable and pressing issue of Catholic emancipation. A number of Presbyterian radicals, such as the linen merchant and volunteer William Sinclair, argued that the revolution in France had proven the suitability of Catholics for democratic political rights, but Charlemont and other established leaders wanted the question quashed as inherently divisive. Despite this, the members of the Whig Club were at this point united in regarding the outcome of events in France as beneficial, and in July 1791 they organised an event at which the volunteers and inhabitants of the town of Belfast were invited to meet and pass approving resolutions on the French Revolution. In July 1791, when the volunteers and the inhabitants of Belfast met to pass resolutions, it was to Sharman that they turned to act as chair, and it was over his name that the resolutions were passed. These are the resolutions of the town of Belfast of 1791 supporting the French Revolution, as you can see signed at the bottom by William Sharman, President. They welcome, I won't go through the details, but they welcome the revolution as men, citizens, and as volunteers. The resolution went on to restate the political relevance of the volunteers in quasi-revolutionary terms, declaring that we think the force of the people should form the guarantee of freedom, and that their freedom is the only sure guarantee of public happiness. Sharman himself acted with Henry Joy as the conduits between the Belfast Committee and contacts in the French National Assembly in Paris, as well as revolutionary societies in Nantes and Bordeaux in 1791. And in addition to these formal proceedings, Sharman also presided over the volunteer demonstration, or what might be better described as the political pageant, that celebrated both the American and French revolutions and an incipient constitutional revolution in Poland, and connected these to the emerging campaign against colonial slavery and to the Irish campaign for parliamentary reform. So this isn't just about speeches and debates, it's also about political theatre, about parading to physically demonstrate support for these causes. At the ensuing dinner, multiple toasts were drunk in praise of American and French revolutionary ideas and heroes. A toast was also made to the Society for Abolishing the Slave Trade at this time as well. And unquestionably, the Bastille celebrations of 1791 were the pinnacle of William Sharman's political career, placing him quite literally in the centre of a demonstration of unmuzzled Belfast radicalism. We don't have any images of that parade in 1791, or indeed of the succeeding one in 1792. What we have is an imagination of what it might have looked like 100 years later, again by John Carey. You know, we saw the illustration of the volunteers. So this is Carey's image of the volunteer parade to commemorate the fall of the Bastille, in this case in 1792 in Belfast. However, developments were already afoot which would render this political vision marginal and divide the celebrants of 1791 into opposing camps. Despite the choreographed unity of the Bastille Day parades that July, the volunteers were still publicly disagreed on the Catholic question, and the resolution for full and immediate emancipation prepared by the Dublin lawyer Theobald Wolfe Tone on behalf of the most radical of the Belfast activists was defeated at the public meeting of 1791. A secret committee was then established within the Belfast volunteers, including Samuel Neilson, who's here tonight, has written about, and Henry Joy McCracken, and taking inspiration from William Drennan's scheme for, quote, a benevolent conspiracy, a plot of the people, which was formed in May 1791. And it was not prepared to accept, this secret committee was not prepared to accept the cautious gradualism adopted by the majority. The committee began working to establish a secret society to take forward the agenda of connecting full and immediate Catholic emancipation with radical parliamentary reform. Now, the following year, in 1792, an attack of gout led to Colonel Sharman taking a lower profile during the Bastille Day celebrations of that year. But his old colleague from the Dungannon Conventions, John Crawford of Crawfordsburn, later his son's father-in-law, Major of the Independent County Down Regiment, and also a friend of Drennan and the McTeers, replaced him as the reviewing general at the Belfast volunteer demonstration of the 14th of July 1792. Colonel Sharman, however, was toasted in absentia at the celebratory dinner that followed. And at that point in 1792, a quote, fiery and anti-monarchical address from the citizens of Belfast to the French National Assembly, penned by Drennan, was approved by acclamation at the associated public meeting, while Tone's more carefully worded resolution on Catholic emancipation was now also passed by a substantial majority. So in 1792, the opinion in Belfast has shifted in a much more radical position. Sharman isn't there. Some of the newspapers claim that he's fallen out with the reformers, but he writes to say that he fully supported what happened. His unit, the Union Regiment, parades on the 14th of July 1792, and he goes on in the following months, when he's back on his feet again, to reiterate his support for the principles of the French Revolution. So Sharman himself had written to the regiment stating that, to the Union Regiment stating that you are going to commemorate a revolution which has restored 26 millions of the human race to the dignity of human nature from the lowest state of slavery. And I make no doubt that every man of you will feel satisfaction in rejoicing at such an occasion. So no backing away from the principles of the French Revolution on his part at that time. The regiment maintained a consistent reputation for radicalism and support for Catholic emancipation. Indeed, in August 1792, Sharman vetoed the application of two newly formed companies to join it on the grounds of their holding, quote, peep-a-day boy principles, that is, association with anti-Catholic secret societies. The emergence in County Down of volunteer units openly supportive of Protestant ascendancy was, however, a straw in the wind, and it may have been a reaction to the outbreak of sectarian clashes in the Rathfridan district in that summer. Now, interestingly enough, rather than distance himself from the younger radicals, Sharman meets with Wolfe Tone in August 1792 at Spa in County Down, where Wolfe Tone, interesting enough, was staying as a guest of Lord Moira, and agrees with him on the necessity of working with, in collaboration with the Defender organisation in South Down to promote the objective of Catholic emancipation. So there's a lot of common ground between Sharman and the United Irishmen, but he chooses not to join this organisation. So why is that the case? He is elected in 1793 again to chair what becomes the last of the volunteer conventions, meeting again at Dungannon in February 1793, which is fully committed to Catholic emancipation. In fact, it supports the entire United Irish agenda except for republicanism. It explicitly rejects republicanism, and this may reflect again his own personal politics. And this latter point frustrated the younger cadre of ultra-radicals who had formed themselves into the secret society of United Irishmen in October 1791. Of these, Lord Edward Fitzgerald and Archibald Hamilton Rowan attended the final Dungannon Convention from Dublin as observers, while others, such as the Reverend William Steele Dixon, as a delegate from County Down, took the opportunity to promote his radical tract, Scripture Politics, at the convention. Before breaking up, it condemned the government's plans to raise an Irish militia and vowed never to dissolve the volunteers. So this, however, is the last hurrah of the volunteers. I am getting towards the end now. The volunteer movement was formally suppressed by government proclamation in a number of proclamations in the spring of 1793. An Unlawful Assemblies Act passed by the Irish Parliament in July 1793 rendered it illegal to hold the description of conventions and congresses with which Sharman had been so prominently associated since 1782. So soon after the last flourish at Dungannon, it appeared the non-revolutionary campaign for reform in Ireland was now dead, and radicals were faced with the stark choice of accepting defeat or initiating a conspiracy for the violent overthrow of the status quo. By the early 1790s, the politics of Sharman and his generation of volunteer leaders was becoming anachronistic. His ideal of enlightened political virtue was out of tune with the more programmatic ideas of the younger radicals. Although they were at first reluctant to admit this. In a mutual understanding in 1791, Samuel McTeer passed to Sharman a copy of William Drennan's paper proposing the formation of a quasi-Masonic secret society within the volunteers, what becomes the United Irishmen. Not comprehending it, Sharman passed it to his friend George Black, whose son, George Black, who's a former sovereign of Belfast, whose son in turn sent it to Dublin Castle. So despite his high patriotic reputation, he was something of a security risk to the incipient United Irishmen, but they're extremely reluctant to break with him despite this. However, faced with this choice of essentially accepting the government's diktats or moving into a secret conspiracy, potentially in alliance with France, Sharman chooses to retire to his estates in the course of 1793. Many of the old volunteers, such as Sharman, withdrew indeed to their estates and from active politics, even in some cases tacitly or actively supporting the counter-revolutionary yeomanry in the lead up to the outbreak of rebellion in 1798. Now, this is not the case with Sharman. He never supports the formation of the yeomanry, unlike his former allies, Henry Joy and William Bruce. The Orange Order was active in Moira by 1798, and numerous arrests were made there shortly before the Battle of Ballynahinch, which was famously depicted here by Henry Robinson, brought to a bloody end the insurrection in County Down. Led, of course, by Henry Munro, himself a former volunteer officer from Lambeg. A triumphant Orange demonstration was held at Moira Castle in July 1799, which the artist Gabriel Beringer, who was then a house guest, suggested was imposed on the residents, with at least a superficial display of orange colours being required for their personal safety. So it's a kind of humiliating defeat imposed upon them, even though they're not actively involved in the United Irishmen. So William Sharman evidently clung to the symbolic memory of volunteering, even as its legacies appeared to be disintegrating around him. At some point during the cataclysmic year of 1798, he found time to commission the peripatetic English artist Thomas Robinson, then resident in Lisburn, more famous for his depiction of the Battle of Balnahinch, which we've just seen. So he commissions Henry Robinson to paint his own portrait, Sharman's portrait. Sharman chose to be represented sitting, as you can see here, outdoors in his domain, wearing his now obsolete uniform as the colonel of the Union Regiment of Volunteers, and prominently displaying his silver regimental gorget of office. A volunteer review is shown as taking place in the background outside Moira Castle, and the colonel is holding a motion for reform in his left hand, and what appears to be a draft of a patriotic speech lying atop a sword is by his elbow. The demeanour of calm defiance with which Robinson depicted his face suggests the sitter's belief that despite the disasters of that year, the ideals of the movement would even yet be vindicated. Now, William Sr. Has a debilitating stroke later in the year in 1799, and his son William Jr., later William Sharman Crawford, following his marriage to John Crawford's daughter, Mabel, was by 1803 an officer in the Moira Yeomanry, although a staunch opponent of Orangism and an admirer of his father's volunteer politics. Colonel Sharman himself died at Moira Castle in 1803. And an elegiac sonnet, as you can see here, appeared in the Belfast newsletter, lamenting the death of Sharman. Lamented Sharman is no more, the friend of genius, to his country dear, a patriot proved, inflexible, sincere. So let me just finish then by suggesting that this it's interesting enough. I mean, Sharman himself writes a poem, a private poem, which is never published, in 1798, hoping that a spark of Gallic inspiration will lead to the revival of the Reform movement. So even in the midst of the despair of 1798, there's evidence that he had hope, that there was hope for the future. He places very much his hopes on his son, William Jr. So volunteering's legacy in many ways was contested in the 19th century. But William Sharman Crawford, as he becomes, and this is a painting which the Ulster Museum acknowledges is by Thomas Robinson, painted in 1798, portrait of a young man, possibly a United Irishman, almost certainly not a United Irishman. In my view, almost certainly William Sharman Jr., published or painted by Robinson when he was also painting his father's portrait at Moira Castle in 1798, not least because there's quite a close description of this painting in the sale catalogue of the contents of Crawfordsburn House from 1947, which more or less describes this painting. So it was almost certainly at Crawfordsburn and therefore within the family. So I think that this is the young William Sharman, later William Sharman Crawford. So he very much seeks in his political career in the early and mid-19th century to revive his father's politics of volunteering and radical democratic parliamentary reform alongside social reform within his campaigns. And it's quite clear that there is a kind of continuing legacy of a memory of volunteering within the city of Belfast. For example, in the 1832 Belfast election, there is a celebration of the memory of volunteering. It's clear that exists also in many parts of the Ulster countryside, and that liberal or liberal radical politics in the early and mid-19th century continues to make use of that memory. So what I want just to finish with is to suggest that the ideas of radical volunteering don't die with William Sharman, despite all the kind of setbacks of the late 1790s, but are carried forward into the 19th century through the politics of his son, which I'm quite happy to talk about in questions if people are interested in it. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to finish there. And again, happy to take any questions.
thank you very much for a very comprehensive talk. In some ways, was Sharman a voice crying in the wilderness?
Well, I mean, what's interesting is that he does have significant popular support. It's very difficult to quantify these things in the absence of public opinion or public opinion polling, in the absence of free elections. But the sheer numbers of people involved in the volunteer movement, particularly at its peak in 1782, 1783, again during its revival, as you say, the numbers of members of the Union Regiment, for example, go up from 300 to 900 between 1789 and 1792. So it's quite clear that, that there's a kind of surge of interest in the movement. So I think at certain times there is evidently a constituency which is in support of him. That constituency, however, is kind of squeezed out of existence by the repression of wartime. So people essentially are forced into making this choice as to which pathway to take in 1793 through the repression of a public mass reforming movement by the state. So in that way, from that point onwards, you could say perhaps he does become a voice in the wilderness.
Sorry, William Sharman Jr., what was his view with regard to Catholic emancipation?
Yeah, so he, even as a young man in 1812, he signs a County Down resolution in support of Catholic emancipation. There's a number of County Down gentlemen who do that. His first public political activity is as a member of a kind of liberal Protestant organisation that supports Daniel O'Connell's campaign for Catholic emancipation in 1829. So William Sharman first appears on a public platform in Dublin in 1829 in support of O'Connell's campaigns. He supports the O'Connell testimonial, sends money for that, and then he also appears at Newry speaking alongside the Catholic clergy at Newry, the opening of the new chapel, which becomes the cathedral in 1829, again in support of Catholic emancipation. So, I mean, he is very consistent, particularly from that point onwards, as a supporter of Catholic political rights, not just emancipation, but the removal of all religious restrictions.
Peter, thanks very much for a really interesting lecture. The reference to the Temple of Liberty, suggests that Sharman was very much a man of the Enlightenment, and it even, although I'm not a Freemason, has Masonic overtones. Do we know, was William Sharman a Freemason at a time that it was reviving?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's huge interest and participation in the Freemasonic orders in late 18th century Ireland. I haven't found any explicit evidence that suggests that William Sharman is a member. Paradoxically, his great-great-grandson, Colonel Robert Gordon Sharman Crawford, who was one of the kind of leading figures in the Ulster Volunteer Force in the 1912 to 1914 period, is the leading member of the Masonic Order in County Down. So at some point the family is very heavily engaged in it, but I haven't come across explicit evidence that suggests that William Sharman in the 1780s, 1790s is a member. His son very definitely is not a member. So I suspect he probably isn't. But you're right. I mean, certainly the enlightened ideas which he gives voice to are shared by many people within the Masonic movement at the time.
Now, I'm not all that well versed in history. Okay. The French Revolution, was a glorious thing, but it quickly deteriorated into anti-clerical acts of outrage against clergy and things like that. Would Sharman and his colleagues have been well informed of what was happening in the aftermath of the revolution?
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, the French Revolution is not a fixed event, but a very dynamic series of events with a process of radicalization going on. I think, like many British non-violent or non-revolutionary reformers, he is enthused by its early phases, and he is prepared to support it at least up until the Battle of Valmy in summer 1792, isn't it? The Battle of Valmy. Beyond that, he doesn't make any more explicit comments on it. The Volunteers and the Volunteer Convention of 1793 is opposed to going to war with France. So I think he is probably, but he is not an enthusiast. I mean, Ken is the expert on this, but he's not, I think, in any way enthusiastic about Jacobinism, which obviously, you know, a lot of the younger radicals in Belfast, like Nielsen in particular, are. You know, so I think it's had he remained in public life longer than early 1793, it's likely that we may have seen him, you know, moving away from an overt support of the French Revolution, just as, you know, people like Henry Joy and William Bruce are very much moving away from their initial enthusiasm about the revolution by late 1792, early 1793. The execution of the king, of course, is a highly controversial event at the start of 1793, which is highly divisive, and you know, leads some former supporters of the revolution to you know, renounce their support. So we don't know, because he kind of dropped. I mean, it may have been one of the reasons that he does drop out of public life. He'd been so strongly associated with the revolution that for him it's difficult then to follow it through its more radical phases and to continue supporting it in a way, obviously, that Nielsen and Tone and others do.
It's my understanding that you're researching a biography of William Sharman Crawford. Any idea of the publication date?
I don't have a publication date. I mean, it's approved in principle. The book is written. It's approved in principle with UCD Press in Dublin. So there's a bit of editing involved. The book's very long. It needs a little bit of editing to kind of get it into a kind of more manageable shape. I'm hoping to get that done over the next few months. So ideally, the end of this year. Academic books tend to, you know, take their time to move through the presses. Hopefully next year by the very latest.
Hopefully it'll be before Christmas and we can start reading.
I'll do my best. Thank you all very much.